It's a game engine, of which you have several, for example, Unreal Engine or even CryEngine or other engines. Sometimes large companies have their own engines, their own software, with the different functionality, with some secret stuff that allows them to look even better than their competitors. But Unity is a software that is publicly available to other people for a fixed fee or free until you start earning decent money. And their idea is that they work on creating the most commonly used functionality in the games. People use this software and ship their own games and pay them fees. Unity is a game engine, and its task is to take 3D decorations, sounds, music, various animation and visual effects, and to ship an executable, a file that can be uploaded to Google Play, App Store, or placed on a mobile device or shipped in some other way, for example on the Steam. It really takes the files and combines them together, wrapped up in your logic, expressed through scripts and code. This is basically what Unity is doing. It's a software to combine things together. You're given several windows. There is the inspector, the hierarchy, the project, the console behind it, the scene and the game view. The project is a tab that shows you all of the folders that you have for your access. It has packages, which are just collections of things commonly used by you, and various extensions that might be useful for you. And assets is really the things that you use for developing your own game. So, for example, you would put decorations, your scripts, and stuff into the assets. And packages are mostly for stuff that you pull from the cloud. All of these things, the project stuff, is being done in this tab. You can see that in the assets I currently have two folders. One contains the scenes, so it's called scenes. We can double click on it and rename it. Or press F2 while it's highlighted to rename it. And there is a scene file in here. And also there is a furniture folder. It's a free collection of assets with the furniture. Has several subfolders. You can see that it has two of them and a scene. But you could click here as well to see that these two folders are right here. And also in the source folder, there is some other stuff hidden. So if we were to click in here, we would see that there is a materials, mesh, and textures inside of it. And in the meshes, there are several 3D geometries expressing different furniture pieces that you can use. If you don't see these icons, or if you see a list, there is a little scroller here that you can click and drag to the left, for example. All the way to the left will turn them into a list, and all the way to the right will make them as large as possible so you can see their previews. Each one is an asset, and you can see that if you click on this triangle, there's something sitting underneath of it. This is an asset, so if you click on it, you can see that its extension is FBX, a very commonly used extension for your assets for the 3D models. This one is probably also FBX, yeah, you can see that is FBX. This one as well, but they could be OBJ, or maybe some kind of .blend if it's a Blender file, or 3ds if it's a 3ds Max file. But FBX or OBJ usually for 3D models. And you can see that while we're looking at this FBX, there are some settings that you can look through while you're importing it, to make sure that Unity treats this asset in a specific way, this 3D model. If we click on this triangle, you can see that this FBX contains something inside of it. And this grid represents a collection of points, to which we refer as a mesh. It's basically a collection of 3D coordinates that describe the shell of your object. You can left click and drag here in this window, and if you don't see it, you can click on this horizontal thing and pull it up until you see the preview. But basically it's a 3D collection of points, which is called the mesh. It contains almost 2K vertices and 1700 triangles. Triangles are just connecting each vertex to form a polygon. And if you're an artist, this thing also has a UV1 and UV2 coordinates. But I'm not going to focus on what those are. The amount of vertices and triangles is decent for this model. You should really watch out for having as few of them as possible while still preserving the curvature and nice details of your models. The more of those vertices you have, the tougher it will be for your device to render. For example, the mobile phones will struggle to render models that have too many vertices. And if you do use lots of vertices, then you'll have to trade off on using some simpler graphics and fewer post-processing effects and fewer particles, for example. So it's about finding a right balance. But the budget of vertices is always limited. Try to use as few of them as possible on each 3D model that you bring into your project. If we reduce this thing down, you can see that if we actually click back on the asset itself, not on its mesh, The asset contains several commonly used important settings. It defines the scale factor that this object will take by default if we were to click and drag it into the scene. For example, at the scale factor 100, the object takes this size. But if I were to change it, for example, to 1000, then it's going to be 10 times larger. So I'm going to scroll down and click Apply. And you can see that if I were to drag it back into the scene, now it's by default 10 times larger. So it's pretty big. This setting is very useful if you want to bring it to some common factor. For example, your artists might be working in the centimeters, or maybe there is an asset that you bring from the asset store that was working in inches. So you could scale the stuff by 1 over 2.54, which is 1 over a single inch, to bring them to a common denominator, basically. There is other stuff, like do you want to import the cameras? That might be also defined in this FBX file. Do you want to take the axis? For example, if you're bringing files from 3ds Max, the Z and Y axis might be flipped, and you might need to use this checkbox. Some other stuff like blend shapes, which allow you to morph objects and are very useful for facial expressions. Do you want to bring them along into the Unity, or do you want to strip them away to save performance and save space, conserve memory? Do you want to import the cameras or the lights? In many cases, if it's just a decoration, then you would want to have them unticked. But if you don't have them in your model, then you might as well just leave it here when importing 3D models. Those things are typically accompanied by stuff called textures. So if you have 3D models somewhere in your folder, there's probably somewhere a folder with 2D images. We call them textures. There can be different types of textures. You could have textures defining the color, so that when you apply them to your models, they color them and give them appearance of different color variations. There's some stuff like normals to give them extra detail when they're being illuminated by light, but all of this happens at a later stage. In addition to textures and 3D models, the meshes, there's also materials. Materials is just a collection of colors that have a special color that you can use, and also which texture, which 2D image they're using. And some other properties like smoothness or metallicity that will be applied to the 3D model if you were to drag this material onto it. The project folder allows you to see all of these things, to arrange all of your assets along the folders, to really create a structure of your project, to add sounds, to add scripts, to sort out your scenes, and so on. All of this happens in here in the project. And if you're really feeling like a true hacker, you could right-click here and add a tab to add a second project tab. And you could even click and drag it to the side, so you have it like in a Total Commander style. So now you have two projects folder, and you could have a look somewhere here at some folders, and then do some other stuff in the other project folder to drag and drop easily things between the two things. And if you don't like this, you can right-click and close the tab. You might want to restructure this UI layout to your liking, but it's up to your personal preference. The hierarchy defines the objects that are currently placed in your scene. And whatever happens in your scene, you see through this window. If you were to right-click in the scene window, you can have a look around. And if you wanted to move, while holding the right mouse button, you can press WASD to move around just like in the game. And you can continue looking around while this right mouse button is pressed on your mouse. You can use the middle mouse button to pan around, and left click and drag to select objects, or several of them. And of course you can click on them like this. By default, the sample scene contains always a camera and a directional light, but you could press Ctrl, select multiple of them, and hit Delete, which is going to get rid of them, and you're going to have an entirely empty scene. The star next to the scene in the hierarchy window defines a scene that is not saved yet. So you can press Ctrl S to save it. And if you wanted to see where this scene is located, you can right-click on it and select a scene asset, which is just going to highlight it in the project folder to see where it's located. Finally, there is an inspector window. You can click and drag it to be somewhere near the hierarchy, for example. It shows you all of the details about the currently selected object. For example, it's going to be showing you the details about the FBX models as you select them. Or if you have something in the scene, like if I'm going to Ctrl Z everything, I can select the light here, and the inspector has a scroll bar that allows me to look at all the things attached to this light. For example, there is two components. on it currently on this entity. There is a transform, which defines position and rotation, so the tilt of this light, and the scale. The scale doesn't matter for the lights, but it might matter for 3D models, such as furniture. And also the second component defines everything related to this light, various settings that you can tweak, and so on. This is the inspector. And if you wanted to lock the inspector so that whenever you click on things, it does not update, you could click on this lock icon right here. And now if you were to click on the camera or the sample scene in the folder or some kind of 3D meshes, this thing is not going to change. It's going to remain locked on this light in this scene. And this is very useful because sometimes you might want to keep it locked, but to double click into the folders and make sure that this doesn't change, and drag and drop things into various slots. So if you're wondering why the inspector does not change, it's probably because you have this lock enabled. Click on it again so that it becomes responsive once more and updates with your selection. In the scene view, you can see that there is also this cube. You can click and drag on these two horizontal lines to reposition it wherever you like, but typically top right corner is where you'll find it. Right now we're in the perspective mode. So if I were to go into the source files and drag this 3D model somewhere here, you can see that there is a vanishing point. Things further away from us become smaller and things closer to us become larger. If we wanted to work with the orthographic mode, we can click in the center of this cube to turn it into a orthographic mode. For example, it's very suitable for various scientific computations and simulations, or two-dimensional games. And you can click on these arrows, for example on the Z, to align your camera directly along this world axis. You can use middle mouse button to pan around. So if you click on the middle mouse button and drag your mouse left and right, you can pan around, which is just going to be equivalent to you going manually clicking on this tool and then dragging around the scene like this. So save yourself time, don't use these things here, and just use the shortcuts, because it's going to be much quicker for you. Let's go back into the perspective mode by clicking on this cube, and we can focus on objects by pressing F. So if we have something currently selected, we can press F and focus on it. And we can orbit around things by pressing Alt or holding Alt and clicking left mouse button and dragging around. This will make us orbit around the currently highlighted thing. And if I wanted to focus, for example, on the light, I could click on it in the hierarchy, because I don't see it somewhere here, and right click in the scene view and then press F to focus on the current selection, which was my light. So we can either click and select things here, or we can press W, which is just going to turn us into the move mode, and click on these things to pick them by hand. You can also parent things underneath of each other. So for example, we could click the directional light and close it, and click and drag those two things under the main camera. So now we can move them separately like this, the light or the close it, but because they're now child of the main camera, if we were to take the camera and move it around, they are going to follow it. And if we were to press E or select this rotation mode, we're able to rotate our camera, and these children will follow it around because they're like on an orbit right now. So pressing E allows you to rotate the objects, for example, along the vertical axis. You can see that the vertical axis of the world is Y, it's green, and it corresponds to this thing here, the circle around the camera. So we can rotate around the vertical Y axis, rotate around the Z axis, which is like tilting the camera, or we could use the other axis, for example, the green axis. So there is several degrees of freedom that you can use to rotate your objects. There is also an ability to just click and drag in the center somewhere here to simply spin an object without the precision. But you could also always revert back to precise rotation by clicking directly on one of these circles and spinning just around this specific axis if you need to be more precise. As you can see, you can do it through here, so while you're in this mode, or you could do it through the transform component of the currently selected object. For example, I could use the X rotation and change it here, the Y rotation or the Z rotation, and I could reposition the object like this using these sliders. I could also enter the specific values, for example, -1 and -1 here, -1 as well here. And my camera is located in the world on the -1, -1, -1 coordinate. The world has a single 0 coordinate, so the scene will have some kind of central point around which all the objects are being repositioned, so relative to which the objects are being placed. And if I were to position the camera on the world 0, the origin coordinate, as we call it, it's going to be on the 0, 0, 0. And I can press F to focus on it. This is the central point of the entire world, and we place objects relative to it. So if I were to go ahead in the project folder and pick in the furniture, in the source files, in the mesh files, for example, let's go and pick a couch. I'm gonna click and drag it into the scene and press F on it because it's currently selected. I can reposition it and rotate it around. If I want to scale it to reduce its size, I can press R or select this mode, but use R to be quicker. And click in the center on this cube here and drag up and down or left and right to resize it, to make it smaller. Or I could use this scale tool here, but doing it this way will mean that you're going to be adjusting each of the axes individually. And if you want to adjust them all at once, you'll have to do it through this white cube, or simply do it here, here, and also here. So on all 3 axes. For example, I could set it to 0.1, 0.1, 0.1, and press enter. So a really tiny couch. Be careful about creating the objects that are too small because it's going to lead to problems. Try to stay around the reasonable sizes. So don't make microscopic things or gigantic things. In the scene view, there is also an option to show the gizmos. For example, we see that this camera is here and the light is there, but they don't really have 3D geometry or any kind of vertices associated with them. And they are really an invisible item, so you wouldn't really see them. It's only because we are currently in the Unity, during the editing mode, we are able to see that these objects exist. We see what is called their gizmos. This is a gizmo for the light, and this is the gizmo for the camera. If we wanted to turn off gizmos and just have the 3D decorations visible for us, we could click on this button, which is going to turn off all the things and make them invisible until we tick it back on and see that the camera and the light is now once again seen by us. If we wanted to fine-tune which gizmos we show, we could click on this triangle here and look at the list, for example, searching for the cameras, the light, and so on, and disable them. Because my UI scale is so large, I'm not going to be able to see the checkbox here, but in your case, you'll see stuff on the right, and you can click on the checkboxes to untick things and make them visible or not visible. So a really fine-tuned variant of your gizmos. Right now, the only gizmos we saw is the camera and the light, but you might have more. And even you could introduce your own gizmos to highlight different things important to you. For instance, I could pick this closet and press F on it. And maybe in the inspector, I could click on this little icon and give it some gizmo, for example, the orange diamond. And you can see that as we are very close to it, we start to see that there is this gizmo. So you could really mark your objects and have these custom gizmos available to you, even if your object does not have a 3D geometry around it. If you wanted to hide it away, all of them, just click here. And if you wanted to reveal, just click back here again. There is also, in addition to clicking in the center of the white cube in the top right corner to turn it into an orthographic mode, there is also a 2D variant right here, which is going to allow you to do basically the same thing. So it's going to turn everything into the isometric mode. You could click it, and it's going to make it easy for you if you're developing a 2-dimensional game. You can untick it to return back into the 3-dimensional world through which you can navigate and move around and continue working like this. So 2D mode, perspective, and isometric. Finally, once you start playing your game and moving around, you are going to be doing this through a window called Game. So the game is going to be really what your camera sees and what the player will be actually interacting with. Because during the game, players will not be able to click on things and move them around like we do when we are developing the game. They're just going to be working with the controls that you give them here. Maybe in the game view, you'll see that there is an ability button somewhere here and the various objects in front of you. but there is a limited set of controls that you let the players use through the game window. Just like any other windows or any other panels, you can click on the tag and reposition this thing somewhere, for example, in this corner, so that you can see what happens in the scene, but also what's going on in the game view. So for example, if I were to center out this closet somewhere here, and maybe duplicate it several times, you can see that in the scene view, they look like this, but the player is going to be looking through the game view and seeing it as this. The console tab hides behind the project panel, and you could click on it to show what's going on here. It's a good idea to keep the console visible to you at all times, but on my screen, because of the current UI resolution, it's too small. Yet I'm still preferring to keep the console next to my project folder, so that if some kind of errors happen during the game, I immediately see them highlighted somewhere here in red, visible to me. And you could take between showing the normal messages, the warnings, and the errors. So if you don't see any errors, but your game does not work, check that you've disabled or enabled the errors here. And also, if you're playing the game, if this button is ticked, any kind of error that you see in the console will pause the game so that you have the chance to fix stuff. And also you can clear the console, which is going to get rid of all the messages that spawn here under the console as you're playing the game. So it's really useful for testing and debugging. There are some other secret things in the console, like these 3 dots, that allow you to see the player log and editor log, which is just a text document telling you what is happening currently in your editor while this Unity game is playing. But this is all more like an advanced stuff. Just remember that these 3 dots are here as well. A game object is really a container of things. You create a game object which is like an invisible entity, and onto it you attach several scripts, which we call components. However, before we do so, let's save the scene and reposition it into some kind of folder that we'll use as we're building up this tutorial. For example, I have the scenes folder here. I can right-click in the project folder and create a folder inside of it, so the subfolder. Let's call it the one Unity UI. And this sample scene, which is this one, I'm gonna click and drag to place into the Unity UI folder. So now it's under the scenes, right here. And I'll call it one Unity UI. I'm gonna click reload because the thing has changed and the scene name is different. Let's duplicate it. So I'm gonna press Ctrl D with this thing selected and drag it somewhere outside into the scenes folder, which I can click on and see myself here. That's gonna be another scene for the second part of this tutorial, which I'll call game objects. And I'm gonna create another folder right here, call this one 2 game objects. Click and drag the scene into it, double click into the folder, double click into the scene to open it. And because it's a duplicate of the previous one, it has exactly the same layout in the hierarchy, exactly the same objects and the same placement. So it appears as if nothing has changed, but the scene is actually different now. So let's get rid of all of this stuff, including the camera and the directional light. Hit save to make sure that the star goes away, and create our first game object. We can go into the game object, create empty, or we can use the Ctrl-Shift-N combination while we're in the scene. So let's do Ctrl-Shift-N to be real quick. And we can see that immediately we can give a name to our object. Let's call it my game object, so my GO. You'll see this GO convention in many cases because it's a quick and short way to say that it's a game object. And you can see that by default, all of the game objects have the most important component, arguably the most important one, the transform component, defining the position, the rotation, and the scale of the objects. If we try to scale this object, it won't do anything until we attach some kind of 3D meshes onto it to make it visible. Because right now it's literally an empty entity, it's a container. We can add component to it to make it suddenly become a light or an audio source. So we can make a light out of it by attaching it a light component. Let's go light and pick directional for now. So suddenly we have the same thing as we did before. We have an object which is just called my game object and which is really a light because it has the light component on it. We can go into the game object, light and the directional light, and notice that it's going to be just the same thing. Transform with light attached to it with light component. just like we had before. So there is no really a concept of creating a light or creating an audio source. Under the hood is just a game object with some components attached to it, which sort of make it a light, or kind of make it a sound audio source, and so on. If you want to remove the components, you would right-click here on the light and remove the component. Or if you had several of them, for example, you might have light, something different, maybe like a mesh filter. You could click and drag them and reposition them around. Or what might be easier is you could right-click here and move the component up. So now the light is on top of the mesh filter. The game object themselves are empty containers which can accept various components, like we did here. Currently it has 3 of them. But they also have additional things, additional information that they can carry. They have obviously the name that you can see here and which you can use to rename the object. You can also rename them from here, so you select them and press F2, or you right-click on them and choose rename. They have a thing called tag, which is just one of the things that allows you to quickly identify which group does this game object belong to. So is it something related to player, or is it something related to a main camera or respawn? You can add a tag to create your own, but this is how you mark your game objects like this. So you could select multiple of them and give them a tag, for example, of player. Just make sure that it matches the functionality and you don't assign random tags that don't make sense. Finally, game objects have a thing called layer. Layers are more important than tags because it's not just a way of letting you kind of know what groups these things are. Layers really define you like the slices of the world. There could be only 32 of layers, but of tags there could be infinite number of tags. So layers are really like a way to let Unity know that this is something related to water, for example, or this is something that we should not be able to click on, or this is something strictly that is UI. By using layers, we can cull certain things or make them be ignored by the camera, make them invisible to the camera. We could prevent clicks on those things or make it invisible to the player colliders, make certain layers ignore the other ones in terms of physics so that they would pass through each other and there would be no collisions. So layers are more important in that sense than the tags. And finally, the game object has the ability to set certain flags on them, so whether it's static or not. This object is dynamic currently, but if you were to click on this checkbox, it would become static, meaning that you promise that this object will never move during the gameplay. And you could fine-tune this staticness by clicking on this triangle and unticking certain things. So maybe you wanted to contribute to global illumination, which is like lighting stuff, or occlude certain things, so it's simpler for rendering. But maybe you want to have it occlude static unticked, and maybe you don't want it to be batching static. You can fine-tune it here, or just set all of them by clicking on this checkbox. And as we saw before, there is an ability to assign a very simple gizmo, or pick from one of the gizmos that you might have in the project. So it's going to be giving it an icon in the scene view. By default, there should be an icon because you should only assign it to some very important objects, like managers, for example, or maybe a player. It just allows you to see that there is an invisible game object, which, for example, maybe you have this one, creating a new one, but you cannot see it really in the scene because it doesn't have a 3D mesh on it. You could click on it and give it an icon and suddenly you do see that it's here. Maybe it's like some kind of invisible sensor zone and you need an idea of where it is, so you can click on it and drag it around. Looking at the transform component, we already saw what the position, the rotation and the scale is doing, but there is one more important thing with it related to pivots, and it's better shown on a game object which has 3D mesh. So I'm going to go into the assets and into the furniture, into the source, and go into the mesh, and click and drag maybe on the metal table, and press F to focus on it. This thing will be very easy for us to visualize because it has the mesh renderer and mesh filter components, which makes this decoration visible. I'm going to collapse everything so that nothing is distracting us, and let's focus on the transform. So we can see that there is position, rotation, which allow us to orient the objects, and the scale. But there is one thing, the pivot, and the pivot is really like the center of mass, or the point around which this object orients and rotates around and gets scaled as well. The pivot is defined in your 3D modeling package. Maybe you're using Blender, maybe you're using 3ds Max, but as you're creating this model, there is some kind of point of reference around which you specify the coordinates for this mesh, for this decoration. And to see the pivot, you need to go into this button and pick on the pivot, because sometimes it might be on the center. And center is just placing those axes in the average between all of the points in your model. But if you wanted to see the true pivot, just go and click pivot. And you can also use the shortcut Z. This is a very important shortcut, you should use it all the time. Z allows you to switch between center and pivot. And you can see that around the pivot mode is where the stretching is happening. So it's happening around the bottom, so from the bottom middle part. And this is also where the rotation is happening around. So it doesn't happen around the center of the object or around the top, it orients, it rotates it around the bottom. If you were to move the pivot somewhere else, then the orientation would happen around that point. In certain cases, you don't have an access to a 3D app, or it might be more convenient for you to just do it the simple way. Maybe you want to reposition the pivot, but you would need 3ds Max for that or Blender. But you could do it in Unity to change the pivot of the object, or kind of fake it, by taking this metal table and creating a new child game object underneath of it. So press Shift-Alt-N, give it descriptive name, but I'm just going to keep it as a game object. And once you have it, you can see that it's placed on the 0th coordinate underneath of the metal table, so literally on its pivot. You can click and drag on this thing, put it on top of the metal table so that it's no longer its child. There are two separate things now, the game object and the metal table. But if I were to Ctrl-Z my changes and have the game object and the metal table, I can take the metal table and make it the child of the game object. But let's take the game object and put it somewhere on the top. Here, and then make the metal table its child. So you can see that if I were to select the game object and rotate it, it's going to rotate the table around itself, because the game object is on the top of the table and the table is its child. The child is following the rotation of the parent. So it's a quick and easy way to fake the repositioning of the pivot if you don't have an access to a 3D app. The position and scale are always relative to the parent and the rotation as well. So you can see if I were to take this game object and move it somewhere else in the world, so for example 10 units to the right, 0 up and 0 forward, press F to focus on it, it's displaced 10 units to the right from the center coordinate of the scene. But if I were to click on the metal table, notice how its position will change. The metal table has just position 0, negative 0.65, and 0. Position of children objects is always relative to the game object one level higher, to their parent. And because the game object has no parent, its parent is automatically seen. If we look at the metal table, you can see that the rotation could be, for example, minus 30. So let's do minus 30 along the rightwards axis. But the game object, the parent, has the same rotation as before. Its axes are aligned with the axis of the world. If we wanted to rotate the parent as well, we could do not minus 30, but plus 30. And this would make the parent do its own rotation, onto which the rotation of the child would be added. So the most important thing to remember is that the transformations done to the child are always relative to the parent. When you are working with transform components of the game objects, there are two modes in which you can work with objects. There is the global mode and the local mode. In the global mode, you are taking your object and moving it around, rotating it as you wish, but you can see that the axes for rotation are always resetting to be aligned to the axis of the world. The forward-pointing blue axis is somewhere diagonally there, and the circle is always around that direction. Even if you were to rotate the object like this, the global axes are always aligned to the world. And the position as well. They're all aligned around the world. But sometimes you might wish to move the object around its local forward direction, because its local forward position is in another direction. The way to switch between the local and the global axis, the ones that are aligned to the world and the ones that are aligned to the object's coordinate system, is by pressing X. By doing X, you can see that we're changing this mode from global to local. The local axis allows you to take the object and move it around its own forward direction, for example, or its own rightwards direction, which might be different to the one in the global representation, different to the scene axis. So if I were to take it in the local mode and rotate it like this, I could point its forwards direction to be somewhere in the sky. And I could take and move it upwards along its local forward direction because I'm in the local mode. But if I were to switch to the global, the axis would be once again the world. And these two things, the pivot and center mode, and also the local and global representation of your axis, is very important. So remember to use the Z and the X shortcut. In addition, because the metal table is shifted away from the game object, which is somewhere here, for example, then any kind of transformations that I do to the table itself, for example, if I scale the table around the Z-axis or the X-axis, the changes will happen to the table. But if I were to scale the game object, so for example, if I pick the parent, go into the local mode, and from the pivot of the game object, I were to scale it, you can see that the stretching is happening around the parent point, so around the game object location. And the children get distorted, so the child object gets distorted relative to this point. So be careful when you're scaling things, because scaling the parent might distort the child if it's far away from the parent game object. If parent has a scale, it's going to be applied along the axis of the parent. Prefabs is a way to combine different changes that you've done to your game objects, combine the scripts, combine the meshes into one reusable thing that you can use to repopulate your scene, to clone it several times in various places, and your settings and the appearance will remain the same. So to illustrate this, I've created a new folder, the 3 prefabs, which contains the prefabs scene. Gonna go into it and focus on the main camera, which is currently located at this position. I can go into the game object and create a 3D object, a quad, and focus on it, press E, and then holding the control to make it in the increments of 15 degrees. I'm gonna click on this red axis and rotate it like this. So you can see that I've created something that reminds us of a floor, resembles us. Pressing W, I can move it around in the world or in the local mode of the axis. This is going to be our floor, so let's rename it to floor. It has the mesh filter, the mesh render, and mesh collider, so that we can see this decoration, this 3D model, and this one will help the physics to collide with it. Let's now go ahead and take one of the meshes that we see, maybe the chair, drag it into this position. Let's make the floor maybe of scale 10 by 10 by 10. And take the chair, click on it. Using the shortcut R, let's rescale it in the either the center or the pivot mode. In the pivot mode, it's going to be easier for us because it's going to happen right around the bottom of the object. So clicking in the middle, I'm rescaling it like so. I can press W and press Ctrl D to make a duplicate out of it. Maybe let's take all of them, being careful not to include the quad. And if you do suddenly click on it, you can, while holding the control, click here to untick it and remove it from the selection, because you just need these 3 chairs and the 4th one. And we press Ctrl D, duplicate them again. And maybe in the center representation, so press Z until it's in the middle. You can press E, holding Control, rotate them 180 degrees, like so. And let's stick maybe a table somewhere in the middle. We have the table in the meshes folder somewhere. The round table is most likely not going to be very useful to us. We need something like a rectangular table. So we can click on one of them, and using the up and down arrows, we can go through them and have a look if there is something suitable. So metal table maybe can be used. We've already were using it before. Maybe there is something different, something more fancy, but no, metal table is the only best option we currently get with this asset pack. So let's take this one and click and drag it into the scene. and it's pretty large. So in the pivot mode, you can press Z for that. Let's press W, and from the bottom of it, press R, squash it down like so, and we have a table. So maybe we need to take these chairs, holding Control, selecting multiple of them, making sure not to select the floor, W, and move them away, like this. Now we are able to combine all of them into one single prefab. And to do this, we could take all of them, like all of the chairs, and drag them under some game object. But we currently don't have any game object. So let's deselect them, Control-Shift-N, and create table and chairs. Make sure that it's centered around your object, for example, somewhere here. And it would be actually good if it's at the bottom somewhere. So you can zoom up on it and using the up axis, drag it upwards so that it's somewhere roughly at the bottom of the objects. And of course you have to be in the global mode. Otherwise it's not guaranteed that these axes will correspond to the axis of the world. And now we have the table and chairs, empty game object, which doesn't do anything. But we can take the chairs and the table and parent them under this table and chairs invisible game object. Now, if we take this invisible geo and move it around, we can see that the scaling, the rotation and movement, they all affect the children. And the cool thing is we can now make this thing a prefab. So we can kind of make a snapshot of these objects and the components and then reuse them later. For the prefabs, let's create some folder that we can reuse. Maybe in the third folder for the scene, prefabs for this current scene, we could right click and create a folder, prefabs, just to keep it more tidy. And in the folder, if I double click into it, take the table and chairs and drag it literally into this prefabs folder. Now you can see that there is something with the blue cube icon. This signifies that it's a prefab. So it's like a snapshot of various game objects and the components that are attached to them. This one happens to have several chairs, so several game objects, with the components such as chair mesh filter, mesh renderer, which make it visible, with a transform, with mesh collider, and this happens for all the chairs and the metal table. The metal table has exactly the same components, yet it looks different, just because the actual mesh filter component has a different combination of vertices in it. So the chairs have the same components, or appear to have the same components, but their mesh is pointing to a different collection of 3D vertices. Therefore, it looks a bit different than the table. So now the cool thing is, if we wanted to make an entire room full of these tables, maybe it's like some kind of dining area or a restaurant, we could take the table and chairs and literally click and drag it into the scene. And because we've paid attention and made sure that the parent game object was at the bottom, now if we click and drag it, it's very easy and it's not going to be making the object sink into the floor, because the point of contact, like when we are dragging it onto the quad, it is at the base and the objects are not sinking through the floor like if the table and chairs was somewhere in the middle of the entire thing. It's at the base and it's working fine. So we can click and drag many of them like this. Just a word of caution is that when you're creating these prefabs, for example, when we had this original table somewhere here, it had the metal table, the chairs, and various things. You can actually change the scale of the child objects, so change the scale of the table, like this within the prefab, but it's a bad practice to actually take the parent object and change its scale. The parent object of the prefab should always have the scale of 1 if you intend to turn it into a prefab. If you then later on instantiate a prefab like this, then yeah, sure, go ahead and change its scale like so, but just make sure that as you're creating the prefab, so for example, assume that I get rid of this, I take this table, delete this prefab like so, and right click and prefab unpack completely. If we don't have this as a prefab, as a snapshot, make sure that the scale of the parent is always 1, 1, 1. That's going to make your life easier and it's a good convention. If the parent game object has a scale of 1, 1, 1, then yeah, you can click and turn it into a prefab like we did before. If we have multiple game objects like this, multiple prefabs, we can sometimes break the connection between them and this prefab. For example, if we wanted to take this table and chairs, this one, and make sure that it's not actually referencing or pointing towards the snapshot, does not represent it anymore, we could right click and disconnect it. So prefab, unpack completely. Now, if we were to adjust the contents of this snapshot, the remaining instances will get updated, but this one will remain unchanged. So for example, the cool thing with the prefab, let's go into the table and chairs in our project folder and tweak it a little bit. So we can see that there is chairs. Maybe we want to change the appearance of chairs or add 2 couches somewhere here or 2 armchairs. So for this, I'm going to go into the furniture, into the mesh, and pick one of the seats. Let's see, up and down arrows. Let's do something like this. So for example, photo like this. Click and drag into here. Press F to focus and Alt left mouse button to orbit around the object. Take this object here and pressing Ctrl, rotate it, and pressing R while in the pivot mode. Scale it down. So the scaling is happening from the base, from the pivot. Press W, move it closer. Somewhere here, make sure that it's on the same level as the foot, as the sticks of the chair, so that it's not hovering once the entire thing is instantiated. Maybe it's still too large, so R and scale it down and move it closer. If I were to click on this square between these axes, I'm moving it in the plane, within the plane of X and Z axes. Like so. Looks good to me. And press W to duplicate it and position here. So now that we've edited this prefab from within itself, this changes once we save it. So let's hit Ctrl S and exit the editing of the prefab back to the scene. You can see that the other 2 prefabs have been updated, but the one that we've disconnected did not get any kind of update because it's no longer referencing this snapshot, the prefab. It's an entire separate collections of objects, but they don't point to anything. They don't represent anything, unlike these things. So use it wisely, because if you were to right click and go into prefab and unpack completely, then yeah, these objects are going to be still existing there, but the changes that you do to the actual prefab, they will not propagate to these unpacked things. So keep them blue for as long as possible. So for example, we could click on this chair right here, which is part of the currently connected prefab, press E and rotate it a little bit to give it a slight variation so that it doesn't look so artificial. Press W and click on one of the chairs again, using the green axis, rotate it slightly. Maybe this one could be scaled a little bit down so that there is variety. Maybe this armchair as well, because in the real life it's rarely placed ideally like this. And you can see that even though it's still a prefab and it's still pointing to the same snapshot, we are yet able to introduce some minor modifications, minor changes in position, which are added on top, sort of like an override to whatever is dictated by this prefab. So the prefab itself, if we were to go back into the folder where we've created this snapshot, the prefab, if I double click, it specifies that the table and the chairs and the armchair must be oriented like this. So very strictly and very precisely positioned. Yet we're still able to, in the scene, introduce some additional modification, we call them overrides, onto this prefab, which in my case is the rotation adjustment, and for this chair, maybe a position adjustment and also a rotation. The overrides, so the values that are different to the ones specified in their prefab that they represent, these updated values are shown in bold, so that it's easier for you to spot that they are different to the actual snapshot. And you can always restore it back to the default state by taking the root of your prefab, going into the overrides, and seeing that, yeah, you can see that the chair has some modification on its transform. And you can click on it and see what the actual prefab would want it to be, so very straight, and what we've had for our chair. So there is some kind of rotation on this one. We could click revert and it would align it back to how it's stored in the prefab. so that this override no longer applies in this particular element of the entire snapshot. And you can click Revert All to revert all of the adjustments so that it exactly matches the prefab. But in many cases, you do want to have these overrides to make it look more natural. The prefabs is a quick way to instantiate objects and to make sure that you can adjust them all at the same time really quickly. But it's a nice practice to go ahead and adjust certain things to introduce some kind of variety to each prefab so that they don't look too artificial. And still you can see that even though there are overrides on them, they're still holding on to the connection and do represent the prefab, the snapshot that is stored in the table and chairs. If I wanted to add suddenly cups to all of these tables, I could enter once again their prefab, so table and chairs, and in here stick a cup somewhere, maybe on top of the table. So I could go into the meshes. I don't have a cup, unfortunately, so maybe we could just go into the game object, 3D object, a cylinder, move it up. You can see that its pivot is in the middle of the object, not at the base, so it's a bit inconvenient, but we can do our best to align it like this. And let's scale it down using the middle of this cube. Drag it down like so, position it here, maybe scale it to make it more flat, more squashed, and place it somewhere here onto the table. And let's rename it to say cup. You can also click on this chain so that if you were to change the scale, it would be applying to all of the scales that you've currently assigned. So it's not per axis, but all at once. Or you could just use the gray cube in the center here when you're scaling. I'm gonna undo all of that, Control Z, because I liked the placement. And you can see that now if we do save it, the cup is gonna appear on all the instances of our prefabs. You can see it's here, here, and here. They have their own overrides for certain elements. So there is an override for these chairs. They have some slight different rotation to whatever is stored in the actual prefab. But they all have the cups, which is exactly what we need. Maybe on some of them, we would want to take the cups and reposition them, so modify the values of the transform component a little bit. And we are actually even allowed to remove certain components. So for example, maybe shouldn't be any capsule collider on the cup for this table. So I'm gonna right click and remove the component. And you can see that it's still kind of like a ghost because it reminds us that even though we disposed of it, the actual capsule collider is present originally by default on the prefab. And if we were to attempt to restore it, then reverting it would reintroduce the capsule collider back to the cup. But this particular table and chairs thing does not have a collider now because it's a change that I've introduced into the specific cup. Maybe I could take the chair or maybe even the table and remove the mesh collider for the table of this specific instance of the prefab. Now the table does not have the mesh, but once again it reminds us that it used to be there. So we could right click and remove component and revert it so that it's introduced back as is desired by the actual prefab that it's instance of. Or if we are actually very happy with it and this change is, we're thinking that it should be on all of the tables, there shouldn't be any mesh colliders, nor here, nor here, nor on this one. Then we can return back to this table, click on it until we get this metal table selected. The mesh collider is currently removed on it. We could click on these dots, remove components, and apply this change to the actual snapshot file here, which is going to make sure that all of its instances also will lose this collider from the table. So you can see if I click on this table, now there is no mention of such a collider at all, as if it didn't ever exist. And this table will not have it either. If I can get into it, you can see that there is no mesh collider anymore on it. But remember that there is one instance of prefab that is no longer part of it because we've disconnected it and it's just separate objects which are no longer its instance. So this table and chair is just a collection of objects. If we were to go into its table, you can see that its mesh collider is still there because this thing is no longer controlled or no longer connected to the table and chairs. It's a separate entity. Be careful about disconnecting them because you are going to be losing the ability to receive such modifications. But sometimes it's a necessity. If you are working with a prefab, so for instance, this thing, the instance of the prefab, while you are able to introduce minor modifications, such as changing the values of the components, like maybe even the position of the transform, or disabling some of the components temporarily, or even using some different materials on them or meshes. Even though you are allowed to do this, you are not allowed to destroy the game objects. So you cannot take this game object and hit delete, because this is not allowed. You are only able to disable the game objects, so you can toggle them away to hide them away, but you're not able to remove them until you actually decide to completely drop the connection to your prefab. So you could go to prefab, unpack completely, and then you would be able to destroy your game objects. But while it's still holding the connection, so I pressed Ctrl Z, while it's still holding the connection, you are not able to destroy the game objects. You must, if you really want to do it, to destroy the game object, you are forced to go ahead and open the table and chairs and do it from here, which is just gonna get rid of all of the chairs for all of the things. So I'm gonna save, and you can see that the chairs have disappeared from all instances. If you want to remove the chairs, then it's better to pick them and just hide them away specifically. So you could take this one, hide it, maybe this chair, you could also hide it away, but it's still there, and the entire thing is part of the prefab. It's just disabled. So overall, you can remove the components, you can toggle and disable and enable the components, you can change the properties, and you can change even the meshes that they use, like maybe you can change the collection of vertices to be the closet, and suddenly it would be another mesh. If I'm to re-enable it, you can see that the mesh collider is using another mesh, so the closet, and maybe we can change the mesh to be closet here as well, like so. So I've kept the same components as the prefab is telling us, but I've adjusted certain things, certain properties of it. I've changed the points that it's using, the vertices. I've changed the position of it and the rotation specified in the original prefab. But I'm not allowed to destroy the game object. I can only toggle it off and on.